I knew the axe was coming the second. Stuart Henderson leaned against my cubicle wall like he owned the oxygen in the room. He was the new vice president of enterprise accounts, a slick 34-year-old with a custom-tailored suit that looked too clean for someone who had never spent a Sunday morning placating an angry client over a cup of lukewarm gas station coffee. He had been at Aegis Technologies for exactly 18 days. Spate. But he carried himself with the supreme confidence of a man who believed that spreadsheets were a substitute for human relationships. Chief, he said, because that was his favorite word for people who had actually built this company while he was still in middle school. Your little handshake diplomacy thing is cute, but we are moving into a more scalable model. We need a system that does not rely so heavily on individual personalities. Translation: you are fired, but I am going to say it with a grin so you think it is a promotion. I did not blink. I just looked at him, noticing how his eyes flicked to my dog-eared lighthouse binder on the desk. He thought it was just a collection of old meeting notes. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a glass fishbowl conference room with Beatrice Sinclair, our human resources director. The room was freezing, the air conditioning humming a low, monotonous tune. Beatrice had been with the company for 12 years and usually had a warm smile, but today her lips were pressed into a thin, tight line. She slid a severance information packet across the mahogany table like it was a birthday card she was embarrassed to give. She did not look me in the eye. My security badge was deactivated before I had even finished signing the exit forms. They handed me a branded polyester tote bag with our corporate logo front and center. As if a piece of cheap promotional swag would make up for the fact that they had just gutted 37 enterprise accounts with one lazy pen stroke, I was escorted out of the building by a junior HR representative who looked more nervous than I was. My name is Howard Ross. I am 58 years old, and for the last 15 years, I have been the Senior Enterprise Relationship Manager at Aegis Technologies. I started when the firm was just 10 people in a drafty warehouse, and I had personally closed the deals that allowed us to move into the top 3 floors of a high-rise in downtown Los Angeles. As I walked past my desk for the last time, I let my fingers brush the spine of my lighthouse binder. That binder had been with me through 2 recessions, a global pandemic, and more red-eye flights to Chicago and Dallas than my optometrist would ever approve. Oof. Inside that binder were 15 years of proprietary relationship maps, renewal sequences, and the kind of client trust you cannot log into a database. It was the same binder that Stuart Henderson had just called Replaceable. What Stuart did not realize was that 3 of those enterprise accounts, our biggest whales, had key person clauses written directly into their contracts. My name was spelled out in black and white. No Howard Ross, no contract. Stuart did not even blink when he signed my termination papers. Somewhere in his buzzword-filled brain, he actually believed that automated email sequences and generic monthly webinars could replace a 6 a.m. breakfast with a client whose child's high school baseball team you had sponsored. He had no understanding of what it took to manage accounts that billed in the 7 figures. On my computer monitor, just before the IT department remotely wiped it, was a yellow sticky note that had been there for 4 years. It said, "Check Section 12C. I had written it during a late-night contract review after a different executive had tried to cut me out of a commission on a deal I'd spent 18 months closing. That clause was my quiet insurance policy, one I had fought for during a tense conference room meeting, that no one else in the building remembered now. I smiled when I saw the note because I knew exactly what was about to happen. The company thought my silence meant surrender, but my silence meant I was counting. I was counting the days until their renewal dates hit. I was counting how long it would take for the first termination notice to arrive. I was counting every single mistake they would make now that they had handed my accounts to a junior manager whose idea of relationship management was sending a generic newsletter with bad formatting. I did not beg, I did not argue, and I did not even look back at Stuart Henderson as I walked toward the elevators. He was the kind of man who believed that winning meant hearing himself talk louder than everyone else. My win would be much quieter. It would be a series of paper cuts, measured and timed, until he was standing in a boardroom, wondering why the air felt so thin. I walked out of the building, my tote bag swinging at my side. The security guard, Gary, gave me a sympathetic nod. Gary was 61 years old, and we had shared a lot of late nights in this building. He knew how much time I had put into Aegis. In my head, I was already planning the next steps. I needed to dust off my lighthouse license agreements and check the last 3 years of revenue numbers for those three whales. I wanted to make sure every confidential file was backed up where it belonged. On my side of the fence. The people who call you replaceable never bother to read the fine print. And Section 12C of my employment agreement was not just fine print. It was a loaded gun with a hair trigger, and they had just handed it to me. By the time I threw my tote bag into the passenger seat of my car, I knew exactly how they would handle transitioning my accounts. Sure enough, 2 days later, an old colleague from the account team sent me a text message. Stuart had rolled out his grand retention plan. It was a single automated webinar and a string of mass emails written like cheap press releases. There were no personal phone calls, no handwritten thank you notes, just glossy PDF files and the hollow confidence of a vice president who believed that client engagement was measured in email open rates. The first client to react was Apex Logistical Solutions, represented by Wallace Thorne. Wallace was a man who did not tolerate corporate fluff. He was 64 years old, had built Apex from a 5-truck operation into a regional giant, and he valued direct communication above all else. He had spent his youth driving those trucks across state lines, and he could spot a corporate liar from a mile away. 2 days after my departure, Wallace received one of Stuart's automated emails. The subject line was, Aegis Technologies Customer Success Optimization. The body of the email was filled with meaningless phrases about leveraging technology and enhancing touchpoints. It did not mention the custom shipping software schedules we had spent months tailoring to their specific regional hubs. It was a cold-form letter sent from a generic corporate mailbox, and to a man like Wallace, who had built his empire on personal handshakes, it was a direct insult. 10 minutes after receiving that email, Wallace sent a formal message to the company's contract inbox. He did not call the office. He sent a short, nuclear-grade email that he had carbon copied to my personal address. The email stated that, pursuant to Section 14.2 of their service agreement, due to the key person change, Apex was exercising its right to terminate for convenience effective immediately. That is the kind of line that makes a general counsel's stomach drop. It was not a negotiation. It was a formal obituary for Stuart Henderson's career longevity. I laughed when I read the copy on my tablet. That account alone was worth $4,000 in annual revenue, which was more than Stuart's entire department's salary budget. I had spent 7 years building that account brick by brick. I remembered one winter when a massive blizzard hit Denver, shutting down the entire airport. Wallace was dealing with a serious health scare with his wife, and their logistics routing was about to fail because of the weather. I did not send an email. I rented a heavy 4-wheel drive SUV and drove 8 hours through the snow on I-70 to meet him at a small diner near the regional depot. I showed up with the updated logistics maps in hand so he did not have to worry about his business while he was at the hospital. Wallace looked at me, covered in snow, and said, "Howard, if you care enough to drive through a blizzard when the wind is blowing, I care enough to keep my business with you when the sun is shining." That was the foundation of our partnership. Now, the entire relationship was gone in the time it took to click send on a form email. Wallace called me on my personal phone 5 minutes later. "Howard," he said, his gravelly voice sounding more amused than angry. "Some kid named Stuart sent me an automated email telling me they are optimizing my account. I told my legal team to pull the plug. If you are not there, we are not there. Where are you going next?" I told him I was taking some time to rest, but to keep his pen ready. To celebrate, I baked a fresh peach bourbon pie using my grandmother's recipe. She had always told me that the secret to a good crust was cold butter and patience. The same applied to business. When it came out of the oven, I used whipped cream to write cost of doing business across the top, took a photo, and posted it on my personal social media page. I knew several of my former colleagues would see it, and it would spread like wildfire through the Aegis office. The funniest part was that those key person clauses were not something the company had offered voluntarily. I had negotiated every single one of them myself, sometimes arguing with our legal department for weeks. Companies hate being handcuffed to an actual human being because it shifts the power dynamics. But my clients had insisted on it because they knew that what they were buying was not just software. They were buying my execution and my personal oversight. My old office calendar was hanging in my study at home now. It had all the critical renewal dates circled in thick red ink. I could see the upcoming dates clearly. Client 2, Summit Healthcare Partners, was due for a contract review in 9 days. Client 3, Vanguard Financial, was due in 15 days. I did not need to reach out to them. The clock was ticking on its own, and the fallout was completely automated. I could picture Stuart Henderson sitting in his corner office, spinning his leather chair toward the window while explaining to the CEO that some client churn was normal during executive transitions. That is what amateurs call losing a customer they thought was captive. Professionals call it a slow bleed, and this was just the first drop. That night, I opened my personal archive and reviewed my contract terms. Everything was clean and airtight. I had drafted those clauses to survive not just bad leadership, but leadership too arrogant to recognize its own limitations. The clients did not need me to call them. They knew the protocol. My departure was not just a minor hiccup in their operations. It was a tripwire that had been pulled. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with an unrecognized number. It was Jeffrey Campbell, the chief operating officer at Summit Healthcare Partners. "Howard," he said, his voice warm and measured. "I saw the announcement about your departure on LinkedIn. Are you doing okay?" It was the kind of question that had nothing to do with my health. He was fishing, checking to see if I had already landed at a competitor. I smiled and kept my response polite and brief. The bleed had officially begun, and there is nothing corporate management hates more than realizing a major wound will not stop bleeding. Exactly 9 days after Apex Logistical Solutions terminated their contract, Summit Healthcare Partners sent their own formal notice. It was a cold, 3-sentence letter. The notice stated that pursuant to Section 11B of their agreement, they were terminating the contract immediately due to the key person change. They did not even ask about a transition plan because they already knew Stuart Henderson did not have one. That account had been my project since the ink dried on their first contract in 2012. I had convinced their chief financial officer to renew during a major budget crisis by flying out to their headquarters with a box of the exact hand-rolled cigars he had smoked at his wedding. I spent 4 days in their office, working alongside their IT team to make sure the software integration was seamless. Now that entire relationship was dissolved with a single digital signature. Before they sent the letter, Stuart had tried to salvage the account by scheduling an emergency call with Jeffrey Campbell. Jeffrey told me later that Stuart spent 15 minutes talking about Aegis's new digital strategy and showing a PowerPoint deck with animated icons representing synergy. Jeffrey cut him off mid-sentence. Jeffrey asked him if he knew the technical database structure they had customized for their regional clinics. Stuart started stuttering, trying to look up the answers on his laptop. Jeffrey then asked if Stuart knew the name of their lead developer based in Boston, whom we worked with every single week. Stuart had no idea, realizing that Stuart was completely out of his depth and had no understanding of their operational needs. Jeffrey hung up the phone and signed the termination letter. Vanguard Financial did not even wait for their formal renewal date. 4 days later, their termination notice arrived in the Aegis Technologies legal inbox. It was signed by Garrison Reynolds, their managing director. Vanguard was a conservative financial institution that managed high-security assets, and they had explicit policies about who managed their digital infrastructure. They wanted someone they trusted, someone who had been vetted over a decade and had personally overseen their SOC 2 compliance audits. The only reason they had trusted Aegis was because I had spent late nights in their Chicago data center making sure their encryption keys were properly configured. They did not want a slick vice president who spent his days posting corporate platitudes on social media. Another major account was gone. In less than 2 weeks, the company had lost $12,000 in trailing 12-month revenue, which represented $30,000 in total contract value. Inside Aegis Technologies, the situation had devolved into absolute chaos. My contact in operations described it as watching a kitchen catch fire, while the head chef stands in the corner insisting that the smell of smoke is just a new cooking technique. The CEO was screaming in his office, the doors closed but his voice carrying through the glass walls. Stewart was frantically calling the clients, trying to offer them massive discounts, but none of them would take his calls. They did not want discounts. They wanted reliability, and they knew Stewart could not deliver it. Manrishin ordered a rapid response plan, which was corporate speak for holding 6 meetings a day where everyone argued about marketing language instead of addressing the core issue. The clients were not buying Aegis Technologies. They were buying the lighthouse system and the relationship I had maintained. That was when the real comedy started. The assistant to our chief executive officer, Preston Miller, sent me an email. The subject line was, "Urgent request for lighthouse retention scripts." There was no greeting, no polite check-in, just a direct demand that I hand over my relationship scripts and client transition notes immediately. They had no idea that those scripts did not belong to Aegis Technologies. Every year, without fail, I had licensed the Lighthouse methodology to the company for a 12-month period at a negotiated rate. That rate was documented in a special services addendum in my employment contract, signed by our former general counsel who actually understood contract law. The day they walked me out of the building was the day that license expired. I did not reply to the email. Instead, I spent the afternoon printing out my copies of the signed agreements, my work logs, and the license addenda going back a decade. Each document was marked employee-originated methodology, licensed, not assigned. My performance reviews over the last 10 years backed this up, repeatedly praising the proprietary relationship framework that had resulted in a 98% retention rate. They had always referred to it as proprietary in my reviews, assuming that proprietary meant it belonged to the company. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson in intellectual property law. My phone rang at 6 p.m. The caller ID showed the main office number. I answered, and before I could even say hello, Preston Miller's voice barked through the speaker. "Howard, you are in breach of your contract," he said, his voice tense and gravelly. "You are required to return the client transition materials immediately. We will file an emergency lawsuit to compel performance if you do not comply." I let him talk. I let him believe he was in control. I did not mention that Section 12C was sitting on my desk, highlighted and ready. Instead, I kept my voice calm. "Preston," I said, "I suggest we review the contract terms together. Let us schedule a meeting with Julian Finch, your general counsel, in the office tomorrow morning." The silence on the other end was the sound of a CCO starting to realize he had stepped onto thin ice. The invitation arrived in my inbox 10 minutes later as a calendar block titled, "Emergency Strategy Session." I accepted and replied with a short message confirming that I would attend, provided Julian Finch was present. The next morning, I dressed in a neutral gray suit, a white shirt, and no tie. I wanted to look like I was heading to a casual lunch rather than a corporate execution. I carried a slim leather folio containing 3 copies of my employment agreement and a blue folder labeled Lighthouse License Agreements. When I walked into the 40th floor boardroom, the temperature was freezing. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed a panoramic view of the city, but the atmosphere inside was tense. Preston Miller was sitting at the head of the table, his tie slightly loose, holding a paper coffee cup. Stuart Henderson was leaning back in his chair, still trying to maintain his arrogant smirk, though his eyes looked bloodshot. Beatrice Sinclair, the HR director, sat to the side, nervously shuffling a stack of papers. Julian Finch, the general counsel, sat next to the CEO, looking over a copy of my exit file. Preston started the meeting by projecting his voice, talking about operational damage, contractual duties, and legal consequences. He used words like loyalty, transition period, and company assets. He claimed that my refusal to hand over the lighthouse materials was actively sabotaging the company's survival. Stewart nodded along, whispering about employee insubordination and how they would replace my role with a team of junior managers who understood modern analytics. When Preston paused to take a breath, I opened my folio, took out the 3 copies of my contract, and slid them across the table. one to Preston, one to Julian, and one to Beatrice. Let us read the document together, I said. I pointed to the yellow flag on Section 12C and the red flag on Exhibit D, which was labeled Employee-Originated Accounts. Julian Finch adjusted his glasses and began to read. He had been a corporate lawyer for 30 years, and he was known for being a calm, analytical defender of the company. But as he read the pages, his hand stopped tapping his pen, his lips moved silently as he reread the same paragraph. He looked at Exhibit D, then back to Section 12C, and then up at me. The arrogant smirk on Stewart's face began to twitch. Beatrice stopped shuffling her papers. The general counsel looked like he had just seen a ghost. Stewart, trying to salvage the situation, leaned forward. "This is all just boilerplate," he muttered. "It will not hold up in court. We can argue he built it using company time and resources." Julian Finch ignored Stewart entirely. He turned to the CEO, his voice low and urgent. "Preston, this is not boilerplate," he said. "This contract was signed 5 years ago during our corporate reorganization. It is fully binding. The predecessor counsel drafted this to resolve a commission dispute, and there are no loopholes. If we try to challenge this in court, we will be forced into a public trial that will expose our entire client loss to the shareholders. Our stock price will take a massive hit, and we will lose the case anyway. Furthermore, Beatrice, did we terminate Howard without cause?" Beatrice Sinclair, the HR director, tapped her tablet, her fingers shaking slightly. "Yes," she whispered, looking at the screen. "The termination paperwork lists the reason as restructuring. There is no cause documented." Julian cleared his throat, his voice sounding dry as he read the clause aloud for the room. "Upon termination without cause, first, all non-compete and non-solicit covenants dissolve immediately with respect to the employee-originated accounts listed in Exhibit D. Second, any attempt to compel post-termination services triggers a mandatory buyout penalty equal to 2.5 times the trailing 12-month revenue of those accounts. Third, continued use of the Lighthouse methodology materials post-termination without a valid license constitutes willful copyright infringement." Julian stopped reading. He looked at Preston, then at Stewart. The silence in the room was absolute. I could see the exact moment the realization hit the general counsel. Under California Civil Code Section 1671, this liquidated damages provision was fully enforceable because it represented a reasonable estimate of the harm caused by losing key client relationships. Moreover, they had already terminated me without cause, and their CEO had just threatened to sue me to compel services. They had walked directly into the trap they had signed. Julian turned to the CEO and whispered, "Preston, this is signed. We have a massive liability, and it is completely airtight." The CFO was called into the room to verify the numbers. He was a senior executive named Bradley, and he had his laptop open, showing the trailing 12-month revenue of $12,000. Zuzine for the 3 accounts listed in Exhibit D. Bradley explained the breakdown. Apex Logistical Solutions was $4,000,000, Summit Healthcare Partners was $4,500,000, and Vanguard Financial was $3,500,000. Under Section 12C, the 2.5 times buyout penalty amounted to exactly $30,000. But the financial damage did not stop there. I reached into my folder and pulled out a separate document. "This is the log of your shared network drive," I said. "Your team accessed and used my proprietary Lighthouse scripts 14 times last week, which was after my termination date. Since the license expired on the day I was fired, this is a clear case of willful copyright infringement under federal law, specifically 17 U.S.C. Section 106. The statutory damages for willful infringement can reach $150,000 per violation, and the law requires the losing party to pay all legal fees." Beatrice, the HR director, looked down at her hands. She knew what had happened. Stewart had ordered a junior coordinator to copy the Lighthouse files from my shared drive onto the team folder on the day I was fired, claiming they needed to keep the scripts active for the junior managers. They had thought no one would notice. I placed 2 sealed envelopes on the table, labeled Option A and Option B. I slid them toward the CEO. "Option A is that you hire me as an independent consultant at $900 an hour with a 200-hour minimum paid in advance. In addition, Stuart Henderson must resign immediately, the company must issue a formal apology for role misclassification, and you must reinstate the lighthouse license at triple the previous rate. Option B is that I decline to assist you. I will walk across the street and join your primary competitor, who has already drafted employment terms for me, and my three whales will transfer their business there. In that case, you will wire the $30,000 buyout penalty plus $1,500,000 in copyright damages to my account by Friday at 5:00 p.m. Stuart Henderson stood up, his face red. "This is extortion," he yelled. "The lighthouse system was developed while you worked here. It is company property." Julian Finch did not even look at Stuart. He picked up my contract, flipped to Exhibit D, and read the text. "The lighthouse methodology is the sole property of the author, licensed annually to the company by mutual agreement." Julian looked at the CEO. "Preston," he said, "the contract is clear. We do not own it. If we go to court, we will lose. The liquidated damages clause is binding under California Civil Code Section 1671, and the copyright logs are undeniable. We have no choice but to pay." Preston Miller looked at the invoice I had printed out, the total of $31,500, Zausen circled in black ink. He looked at Stuart with pure rage. Stuart sat down, his face pale and his body trembling, realizing his corporate career was completely over. The CEO picked up his mobile phone. He had to call the board chairman to explain why they needed to authorize an emergency wire transfer of $31,500,000 to avoid a public lawsuit. I could hear the chairman's voice on the speakerphone, sharp and angry, demanding to know how such an oversight had happened. Preston had no explanation. He just looked at me, his shoulders slumped. "We will wire the funds," Preston said, hanging up the phone. He signed the authorization form and handed it to Bradley, who left the room to execute the transaction. The wire hit my bank account on Friday at 3:15 p.m. By the time the notification popped up on my phone, my old badge could no longer open the turnstile at the Aegis Technologies lobby, but my bank balance had changed forever. Stuart Henderson was dismissed by the board of directors the following Monday, and Aegis Technologies lost $30,000, 0 in contract value within a month. I retired that same afternoon. I now spend my mornings drinking coffee on my deck, watching the sunrise over the hills, knowing that in the corporate world, the people who claim everyone is replaceable are the ones who end up paying the highest price.